The morning of March 30th, 1918 began in a haze of cold mist and drifting smoke over a battered stretch of France. The ground was torn by shellfire, littered with splintered trees and scarred by months of fighting. And yet, through that broken landscape, something no one expected anymore began to take shape. The steady thunder of hooves. Horses, dozens of them, gathering speed across a field that seemed to belong to another century. Their riders leaned low in the saddle, lances lowered, sabres ready, faces set with the grim resolve of men charging toward machine-gun fire. It was a sight that should not have existed in modern war. But that morning, as the German spring offensive pressed hard against exhausted Allied lines, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade found themselves facing a moment where speed, shock, and boldness were their only weapons left. And so, at Moreuil Wood, cavalry once more raced into the heart of a battle that many believed would end their kind forever. The German advance had to be stopped. The wood ahead, thick with undergrowth and shielded by its uneven ridges, provided natural cover for enemy machine guns that were already tearing into Allied positions. The line was collapsing, the road to Amiens lay open behind them, and if the Germans broke through, the war could take a disastrous turn. Amid this chaos rode Lord Strathcona's horse, elite troopers of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Muriel Flowerdew, a quiet, capable leader who understood what awaited them, but knew the risk had to be taken. Machine guns had rewritten every rule of war since 1914, but on this day, in this place, speed and courage would decide the outcome. And so the order was given. The charge began. Horses surged forward. Troopers lowered their weapons. The last great cavalry charge of the First World War had begun. 4 years earlier, when the First World War began in August 1914, cavalry rode into the conflict with the confidence of centuries behind them. European armies still believed that speed, mobility, and shock could break enemy lines the way they had for generations. Men enlisted expecting to fight from the saddle, imagining sweeping charges across open fields, the clash of sabres, and the swift pursuit of a fleeing enemy. The horses themselves, thousands of them, were trained and drilled as faithfully as any soldier. They carried messages, pulled guns, hauled supplies, and stood ready to charge into battle as they always had. But the world they entered was not the one they had been trained for. Machine guns turned open fields into killing grounds. Artillery reshaped the landscape into a vast cemetery of mud and cratered trenches. Barbed wire stretched across the front like a steel web. Cavalry units arrived in France hoping to maneuver, but instead found themselves waiting for a breakthrough that never came. Many troopers dismounted, serving instead as infantry. Their horses became pack animals. Movement became impossible under the machine gun's expanding shadow. Early in the war, cavalry charges were attempted, and the results were catastrophic. Entire squadrons were cut down in minutes, proving that courage alone could not outrun automatic fire. Yet cavalry remained part of the armies on both sides. They scouted, patrolled, and, on rare occasions, seized fleeting opportunities for rapid movement. And, in the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, morale remained defiantly high. These were skilled horsemen, many coming from ranches, farms, and wide-open spaces where riding was as natural as breathing. They lived alongside their horses, caring for them through the winters, feeding them when rations were short, and depending on them for survival. Their mounts became companions, partners in danger, and in many cases the difference between living another day or being caught in the open by enemy fire. As the war dragged on into 1918, both soldiers and horses were weary. The Canadians had fought at Vimy Ridge, at Passchendaele, and across countless lesser-known fields. By early 1918, the German army launched its great gamble, the Spring Offensive, a massive, desperate push intended to shatter the Allied lines before American troops could arrive in force. The attack tore gaps across the front, overwhelming infantry and forcing rapid retreats. Long static positions suddenly dissolved into chaotic movement, and in that moment of crisis, cavalry once again became essential. Rapid mobility was needed, not for romantic charges, but to slow the enemy, plug gaps and hold key ground until reinforcements could arrive. It was in this shifting, desperate landscape that the Canadian Cavalry Brigade received its orders to move toward Moreuil Wood. The Germans had seized the high ground and were sweeping toward Amiens. If they held the wood, artillery observers could direct fire into Allied positions for miles. Losing it could mean losing the road, the city, and perhaps the war's balance. The cavalry, tired and stretched thin, knew what was being asked of them. They also understood the danger. Modern weapons had turned cavalry into relics. Yet history was about to give them one last, terrible, glorious moment before the age of horses in war finally ended. When the Canadian Cavalry Brigade reached the outskirts of Moreuil Wood on the morning of March 30th, 1918, they found a landscape already alive with gunfire. The Germans were entrenched among the trees, supported by machine gun teams who had positioned themselves to sweep the open approaches. Infantry could not advance fast enough, and every hour the enemy dug in deeper. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Muriel Flowerdew, commanding C Squadron of Lord Strathcona's horse, understood immediately what was at stake. The wood had to be taken before the Germans could fortify it completely. Delay would be fatal. There was no time to wait for infantry, and so the decision came down to the cavalry. Flowerdew was not a man of theatrics. He was calm, thoughtful, and deeply respected by the men under his command. Born in Norfolk, England, he had moved to Canada and worked as a rancher long before the war. Horses were not tools to him, they were companions, creatures whose strength and instincts he understood intimately. His squadron trusted him because he never wasted lives, never asked for recklessness, and led from the front. But that morning, as he surveyed the sloping ground that led toward the wood, he saw only one path left, a charge straight into the German line. The German machine gun section holding the eastern edge of Moreuil Wood was perfectly placed. They had open fields of fire, overlapping arcs, and enough firepower to destroy any conventional attack. Flowerdew knew this. Every trooper beside him knew it. But the Germans were in the process of redeploying, repositioning their guns, and for a brief moment, only a few minutes at most, their formation was not yet complete. In those fleeting seconds lay the only chance to break them. Flowerdew raised his sword. Troopers shifted their weight in the saddle, gripping reins and tightening knees. Horses trembled with anticipation. The air was cold, sharp, and filled with the distant thud of artillery. Behind them, other elements of the brigade waited to follow. And then, with a single, unmistakable gesture, C Squadron surged forward. The earth shook beneath the hooves as the riders gathered speed. 90 men charging across an open field, fanning into line as they advanced. The wind roared in their ears, mud and broken branches scattered beneath pounding horses. Some troopers shouted to steady their mounts. Others lowered their lances or raised their sabres, bracing for impact. It was a sound and sight that belonged to another era, yet here it was, alive for one last moment. The Germans saw the charge too late. Machine gunners scrambled to load belts, to swing barrels into position. Some fired wildly, stray bursts tearing into the advancing line. Horses stumbled, riders fell, but the squadron kept coming, accelerating, refusing to break. Flowerdew led from the front, standing high in the stirrups, guiding his men toward the knot of German gunners who were now frantically trying to stop the impossible. What followed was one of the most violent clashes of the First World War's final year. Horses smashed into the German positions, blades struck metal, and shouts broke through the machine gun roar. Troopers leapt from saddles to fight on foot. Others fought from horseback in a swirling, chaotic melee. Flowerdew's squadron broke through the first machine gun line, then wheeled and attacked again, slicing into the second. German troops fell back in confusion, stunned by the ferocity and speed of the charge. But the cost was devastating. Dozens of troopers and horses went down in seconds. Flowerdew himself was hit multiple times, still urging his men forward even as he bled heavily. Yet the squadron's momentum shattered the German hold on the eastern flank, buying the critical time needed for the rest of the brigade and supporting infantry to enter the wood and begin clearing it. As the fighting spread deeper into the forest, C Squadron was nearly destroyed, but its mission had succeeded. Moreuil Wood did not fall that morning because a group of cavalrymen refused to accept that their time had already passed. The fighting inside Moreuil Wood quickly dissolved into close-quarters chaos. Infantry from the Royal Canadian Dragoons and the Fort Garry Horse dismounted and pushed through the tangled undergrowth, exchanging fire with German stormtroops who had already begun fortifying pockets of resistance. The air was thick with splintered bark, cordite, and the raw, metallic scent of blood. Horses panicked and thrashed as shells burst among the trees. Officers shouted orders that were swallowed by the forest. It was no longer a cavalry battle. It had become a brutal fight for every yard of ground. For the men of Lord Strathcona's horse, the charge had done what it needed to do. It broke the German momentum, smashed their forward machine gun positions, and forced them into a defensive scramble. But the cost was visible everywhere. Almost every rider of C Squadron had been hit. Many lay alongside their fallen mounts, men and animals struck down together. Those who could still fight joined the dismounted troops pushing deeper into the wood, determined not to let the Germans regroup. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Flowerdew, mortally wounded but still conscious, was carried from the field. He asked only whether the wood had been taken. He would not live to hear the final confirmation. The wounds he suffered were too severe, and he died the next day, knowing only that his squadron had broken the German line when it mattered most. His courage, leadership, and sacrifice earned him the Victoria Cross, the highest military honour in the British Empire. The citation spoke of superb gallantry and absolute devotion to duty, words that compressed into a few sentences the weight of a man's final moments. Meanwhile, the battle raged on. The rest of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade fought through the thick trees, driving the Germans back inch by inch. The wood itself became a trap of shattered limbs and smoky darkness. German machine gunners re-established firing positions wherever they could find cover, forcing Canadian troopers to advance in short bursts, diving from tree to tree. Every step forward risked a sudden burst of automatic fire. But the Canadians did not stop. Their determination came from an understanding of the stakes. The German spring offensive had already torn open parts of the Allied line. If the Germans held Moreuil Wood, they could direct fire onto the surrounding fields and roads, paving the way to Amiens. Losing Amiens could have split the Allied armies. Holding this ground mattered not just for the brigade, not just for the sector, but for the entire course of the war. By midday, the Germans began to pull back, unable to withstand the pressure inside the wood. Cavalry units that had begun the battle on horseback were now fighting like infantry, using rifles, revolvers, and bayonets to clear the final pockets of resistance. When the wood was finally secured, the exhausted survivors looked around at a field that bore little resemblance to the place they had charged into hours earlier. Trees were shredded, smoke clung to the ground, the bodies of fallen horses lay among shattered branches, and scattered through the clearing were the men of C Squadron, those who had answered Flowerdew's command and ridden into the teeth of modern firepower. It was victory. But it felt like the end of something older, something larger than the battle itself. The clash at Moreuil Wood had proven that courage could win the day, but it had also shown with painful clarity that the age of cavalry was ending. Horses, no matter how brave, could not stand against the iron rhythms of machine guns and artillery. Even in triumph, the reality was undeniable. When the smoke finally cleared and the casualty lists began to form, the scale of the sacrifice at Moreuil Wood became unmistakable. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade had held the line, but the price they paid echoed far beyond that single day. Nearly 3/4 of C Squadron had been killed or wounded. The ground where their horses fell became a silent reminder of a world that was slipping away. And though their charge succeeded, though it halted the German advance long enough for Allied reinforcements to secure the sector, it also marked one of the last times in modern history that cavalry on horseback would shape the outcome of a major battle. In the months that followed, the 100 Days Offensive began, the final Allied push that would drive the exhausted German army to defeat. Tanks, armoured cars, and aircraft increasingly took over the roles once held by mounted troops. The pace of mechanization accelerated, and the cavalry found themselves reassigned, reorganized, or absorbed into units built for a new age of warfare. The thunder of hooves, the sweeping shock of a cavalry line, the old belief that horses and men moving as one could break a battlefield, all of it belonged to a world that the First World War had irrevocably changed. Yet the memory of Moreuil Wood endured. It endured in the regimental histories of Lord Strathcona's horse, in the quiet reverence of veterans who survived the charge, and in the solemn acknowledgement of those who understood what Flowerdew and his men had done. Their courage had not been blind. It had been deliberate, conscious, and grounded in the desperate need of the moment. They knew the odds, they knew the weapons arrayed against them, and they charged anyway, because the success of the mission required nothing less. Historians still debate the last true cavalry charge of the First World War, but few deny that Moreuil Wood stands as one of its final defining moments, a place where modern war and ancient tradition collided in a single violent instant, a place where riders and horses, already relegated to history by the march of technology, proved one last time that they could still decide the fate of a battlefield. Today, standing on the quiet ground where the charge took place, it is difficult to imagine the thunder, the shouting, the fear. The field is peaceful now, the trees regrown, the scars long covered. But the story remains. A reminder that bravery does not belong to eras or to weapons, but to people. A reminder that even in the age of machines, human courage can still shape the outcome of history. And so the charge of Lord Strathcona's horse at Moreuil Wood endures as more than a dramatic episode from the dying days of cavalry. It stands as a symbol of transition, between the age of horses and the age of machines, between old tactics and new realities. It captures the last moment when riders on horseback confronted the cold certainty of modern firepower, and against all odds made a difference. The last cavalry charge was not a triumph of outdated tactics. It was the final heartbeat of an era, carried out by men who understood that their time was ending but who refused to let that diminish their duty. Their story lives on not because they changed the course of the war alone,